And welcome back. We are back on the live stream. My name is Darryl Prowl. It's good to see you again, folks. I got to tell you, sometimes the best conversations take place, folks, when we're not live. It's always the way, right? Whether you're watching sports, you're watching something, maybe a news program. It's the conversations behind the scenes that take place. I want you to meet Phil Edholm. Phil, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It's
Now,
a great day.
Phil, you're with PKE Consulting, right?
I am.
All right, so I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself here shortly, but I want to share with our audience the fact that Phil and I have been jamming here nonstop about the gear we're using in the live stream, about the pros and cons of 4K video as we move forward. This guy's smart. Not only does he understand the space that we're in here and talking about here, Enterprise Connect and at No Jitter, he understands our gear and what we're doing. I like this guy already. So we're going to have fun with Phil. Phil, for the audience who don't know you, and I know there's very few who don't know you, tell us a little bit about who you are and what PKE Consulting does.
So very simply, I won't spend a lot of time on it because it's probably not the most valuable use of our time. You can go to pkeconsulting.com, read about me. My background, I was the CTO, CSO at Nortel, sold Nortel to Avaya, was the VP of Technology Innovation and Strategy at Avaya. And now I started a consulting company about 5 years ago and consult in the industry both to end users and to vendors, really helping the industry move forward through these transitions that we're in. Because I think in many ways we are in a multi-dimensional transformation in our industry. It's transforming from being a standalone industry to being part of a much larger ecosystem. It's transforming to being digitized and part of the digitization revolution in organizations. And so I think this is a time of incredible change, but that means incredible opportunity to have impact and create real value for organizations.
All right, now we had your good friend Brent Kelly on here earlier today. Yep. I understand from Brent that he carries you. Is that pretty much it?
He absolutely does. He absolutely does. You know, I find that, you know, having Brent there, Brent does slides that are just amazing.
They're awesome.
I love what he does. And
that's right.
We make a good team in doing things. We've actually been doing the session that you talked to him about.
Yes. Which for the audience, that's the Microsoft versus Cisco session.
Exactly. We kind of fell into this almost by serendipity. About 5 years ago, I proposed to Eric a session based on an analysis I had done for a client who was trying to decide between Microsoft and Cisco, put together a decision process and a decision tool which actually allowed you to bring the organization together to decide on which solution was better for you.
Right.
First session we did, threw it on, nobody knew what was going to happen. We had 600 people in the session. It clearly hit a nerve because the reality is in this industry, a significant percentage, the majority of organizations have a Microsoft relationship and have a Cisco relationship. Both companies are saying, choose me, choose me, choose me. So they're looking at how do you decide. So we've done the session now for 5 years. Brent and I have done it together for this year and the previous 2, so 3 years. What we focus on in the session is trying to have people understand the differences between the products, not what's the same, but the differences, and how those reflect the philosophical values and cultures of your organization. So, you know, for example, Cisco takes a certain way of looking at a room. A room is a peripheral of the person. When you walk into a room, the room takes on your identity, your personality. Microsoft looks at rooms as resources. You schedule them in, and they're basically part of the meeting of choice. So a very simple but profound difference in the way people think. You know, Cisco is going very much to touch screens on the wall, where Microsoft is going more to a less touch environment where you're working from the desktop. So I think there are definite philosophical differences. We look at the cost differences, those kinds of things to try to help people understand where they need to make these really challenging decisions between two very dominant vendors in the market. Of course, the interesting challenge now is that we have a third vendor that just joined us, Google.
I've never heard of this vendor before.
That's positioned themselves, interesting enough, very much the same. And what's very interesting is, and this is the part that Brent did very well, is he actually takes the two products and contrasts them side by side. And you know, the little joke I said is that, you know, if you look at Spark and Skype, what you realize is there's only 3 letters difference between the two. They're both 5-letter words, start with S. They're only 3 letters difference. And you know, of course, at some point, Microsoft may call it Spark for Business, in which case then they're both SFB. So they're, my point is that in many ways they're more similar than they are different. The differences are nuanced about how you do things, how you buy things, et cetera.
So then as you look back upon the sessions that you've been doing for the last 5 years, and the last 3 with Brent, this year, what was hot or different, say, than years past?
I think the biggest change was the cloud evolution, which really started last year, but has accelerated forward this year.
Yeah.
I think this year, the biggest thing that you're seeing is a real focus on integrating the room with the individual user. So, the idea that if you think about a room, a physical room, the physical room integrated to the users that are not in the room, and how can you make that combined experience much more natural for people? So both companies have really been focusing on that, making it so it's easy to come into a room. So we've gotten to the point where video conferencing, from your PC is actually pretty easy.
Yep.
You click a button, you join a meeting. Now there are 3 of you want to go into a room, and all of a sudden there's a remote control laying on the desk, and
Yep.
you've got to figure out, and you got to click that, and you got to find a number to call, and the reality is it probably takes you 10 minutes, and you don't figure out what to do. There's a real focus on making that natural extension into a room environment where you can use it effectively and easily. I think that's a real transition in both systems. Cloud was a big transition last year. Room integration's a big one this year. I think the other side is the team side is really coming together. We're starting to get into this path of understanding how do we manage interactions over time, right? So, an individual event, I may do a video call, I do an audio call, but the reality is I do those over time. How do they correlate together? Which ones belong together? How do I maintain information? How do I do the things that people don't do well in terms of managing that process of the tasks and the topics I work on? So I think that was the other thing we're really starting to focus as an industry there. By the way, I don't think we've got it yet. I think there's a lot of innovation coming in this space that people can't really even understand yet.
So then next year, out of curiosity, because you got me peaked now, you said, oh, by the way, this is third player called Google. Is it still Cisco versus Microsoft next year, or are you seeing
I think
a
that's
third?
going to be a very interesting question. I think that was a conversation that I came away with as saying, does Google become something that enough of the market is interested in? The interesting thing is that the percentage of enterprises that have a business relationship with Google is actually not that large. So the reality is they don't have that incumbency position to build off of. And that's been really the characteristic of this industry over the last 15 years. The transition to Cisco with VoIP was based on the adjacency to VoIP of owning the data network. The transition to Microsoft with Skype for Business was because Microsoft owned the adjacency of personal productivity software, i.e. Word, Excel, PowerPoint, email, calendaring, and there was this natural extension. So there's really not the same kind of natural extension for Google, so it's going to be very interesting to see if Google begins to get the traction in the market that says that there's a lot of people really interested in understanding that as an option, not just analyzing it as an option. It really has to be important to people.
All right, let's shift gears. One of the big topics we keep hearing over and over again throughout our interviews is the topic of SD-WAN. So talk to me about SD-WAN and SDN and why telecom staff should care.
So SDN is really simple, and telecom people need to pay attention to this because it's going to change our world. So data networks have always been built on the idea that you have a router, and the router has a forwarding engine and has the intelligence to do route paths. And the way routed networks work is the router is connected to 3 or 4 routers next to it, and it talks to them, and then they use protocols to find paths through this mesh of routers. But each router operates as an individual node. SD networks, software-defined networks, is a really simple concept. But essentially it takes that control plane out of the devices and moves it up into a centralized controller. And the centralized controller uses a standardized protocol based on the OpenFlow technology, generally, to tell those nodes what to do. The beauty of SDN networks in the world writ large is you're now able to manage the entire network as a system versus being a bunch of independent nodes talking to each other. For those of us, by the way, in the telecom industry, this is really no different in many thought processes than what we did 10 years ago. Where, if you remember 10 years ago, if you had 1,000 branch offices, you had a PBX in every branch office. With voice over IP and centralization, we were able to take all that intelligence and move it up into the core, into the data center, and only have one instance. We still have phones everywhere because they'd move the voice. They're the voice forwarding engines, but the controls moved to a central location. We were able to do lots of new features, lots of new values, cost reductions, et cetera. That's the same thing that's happening to networks today. But what makes it really exciting for us in the communications industry is when you go read about SDN, and you need to go read about it, go to the Open Network Foundation and read about what they're talking about. They're the group driving SDN. What you'll find is they'll talk about southbound interfaces from the controller. That's what controls those forwarding nodes. Then they'll talk about northbound interfaces to applications. In the world of SDN, we and our communications are an application. That northbound interface allows, for example, a call server to tell the network that it wants a flow between two endpoints and what the characteristics of the network services for that flow. What's the bandwidth, what's the required latency, what's the required packet loss, QoS parameters, et cetera. What this means is we now can actually let the network that has very tight control over the flows actually implement the flows the way we want. And that's going to give us A, much better quality, but B is going to allow us to do very interesting things about price management, cost management, performance management, et cetera. SD-WAN is actually a subset, we'll call it, of SDN, applying that to the wide area network. And especially when you look at multi-paths, like through the IP network. So today, when you get a path through IP, it's done by those protocols, and it's relatively static. OSPF, Open Shortest Path First, says when a flow starts, a bunch of packets get sent up, and the route that represents the first one coming back is the one you use. Well, if it turns out the second after you establish the route, there's a huge flow of traffic, and that path gets congested, you continue to use it, and the voice quality suffers. What SD-WAN solutions essentially do is use that same centralized control to allow the network device to have multiple paths and dynamically assign them to the flows, depending upon the need of the flow, whether it's a database flow or a real-time flow, and dynamically use them. So it actually is going to allow us to do two things. It's going to allow us to reduce cost because we can optimize the resource utilization, but it's also going to allow us to increase quality. And long-term, it's going to enable us, I think, some very interesting concepts where if you have an SDN network and an SDN software-defined network in your enterprise, you'll be able to interact with the carriers that also have software-defined networks to be able to manage your end-to-end flows. Something we've never been able to do in the nodal infrastructure. And again, if you think about it, if you're a telecom guy, think about all the things you can do now that you've got a centralized call service supporting your whole organization that you could never do when you had 1,000 PBXs all over the place and you had to manage them as 1,000 different points of service, points of capability. So that's really what SDN is.
All right. I want to kind of shift gears now into kind of like tomorrow in the context. Let me set the stage maybe as we lead to tomorrow. You've advocated that UC management is a critical component for a successful deployment, right?
Absolutely.
All right. What I want to know is what's changing around that topic, and if I carry on that question, what do you think will be the big topic at the panel tomorrow?
So let me start with what I think is going to be the big topic of tomorrow. And the big topic of tomorrow is how does management, UC management, change into the cloud world? Quite frankly, I mean, if you think about the world we're in, yep, it's gotten much more complex. So most of us are telecom folks. A lot of folks on this video will be telecom folks. If you think about 20 years ago, you had a PBX in the basement. It was a one vendor. There was a wire to every desk. There was a phone on every desk. That was the same vendor. You had a connection to the PSTN. That was typically through the same vendor to a carrier. Yep. It was configured, managed, and operated. It was highly reliable. It was fairly constrained. It didn't touch anything else. Over the last 20 years, we've transformed that system, really in the last 15. The first is we went to voice over IP. Now, that traffic is all running over an IP network with all the abstractions of IP, the issues that we don't solve yet without SDN. We've moved our software to being from a processor that's in the box in the basement to being part of the data center. Used to be there were phones. Most of your phone calls are now made on a PC
That's right.
or on a mobile device. We now have application integration, all the CPaaS capabilities. Now we're taking all that complexity, where at least now it's in systems we can see and manage. It's my data network, it's my computers in the data centers. We're taking all that and we're pushing it up to the cloud. And what happens now when all of a sudden things don't work? You call the cloud vendor and they say, well, it works fine for us, it must be a data network. Yep. You talk to your WAN provider, the guy who connects you to the cloud from your business, he says everything's fine on my side. You go to your internal, everything's fine there. Where's the problem? How do you isolate it? How do you anticipate it? How do you maintain the SLAs that your customers want. And one of the things that really is going to become very critical is most companies want to move to the cloud because there's values in the cloud. It's less expensive. You have a key set of values in cloud delivery. I mean, and just to be clear, cloud, we tend to think about cloud as technology. It's not technology. It's a business model. It's a transformation. I will argue that cloud is the industrial revolution of information processing. Mm-hmm. So, prior to the Industrial Revolution, you wanted hinges for your outhouse, you went to Bob, the local blacksmith, he made you a pair of hinges, took him 2 hours.
Right.
100 years later, the hinges are made in the Stanley Works, and they're now standardized, they're specialized, and they're repeated. So the cost of a hinge came down from 2 hours of labor to 5 minutes of labor.
That's right.
You go into Home Depot today and you buy a hinge, the labor in that hinge is probably 30 seconds.
Yep.
But guess what? You don't get to specify your hinge anymore.
Yep.
You get a 4-inch hinge or a 3-inch hinge, not a 3 3/16 hinge.
That's right.
That's exactly what's happening in cloud. What we're seeing is incredible reductions in the cost of service because things are standardized, they meet the need, and you just buy them off the shelf. And so that's where we're going with communications. The problem is, if you look at people like Microsoft and Cisco in their cloud models, they offer 3 nines. 3 nines of availability, 99.9% available. And the average human being, that sounds pretty good. 99.9%, that's pretty good. In fact, I remember DirecTV had an ad, they said, we have 99.9% reliability, but 99.9% is different than 5 nines or 99.999%. It turns out 5 nines is 5 minutes a year of downtime.
Yep.
3 nines is 9 hours a year of downtime.
Yep.
So I'll take the DirecTV model because it's easy to understand. If you buy DirecTV and they have that downtime, that outage, those 9 hours happen on Super Bowl Sunday when you've got 100 people at your house,
big game.
You got a real problem personally, right? You ain't going to get anybody to come back to your Super Bowl party the next day. If you're a company and you have 9 hours of downtime on your telephone system at the wrong time, it can have a significant fiscal impact. If you're a healthcare facility, if you're any other sort of critical service. So one of the things that we need to do as a industry is begin to understand how to deliver, and I think SDN networking, SD-WAN helps us with this, how we deliver the higher availability and reliability that people need in these critical systems. And part of delivery is how you configure it, how you manage it, how you instrument it, how you monitor it, how you assure that it's delivering what you expect. And that's really why management is so critical. What we're finding is people who don't put in real management systems spend up to an order of magnitude more trying to manage things, and they don't do it nearly as well. Automation, building these systems in, I think is critical. The problem is, just like in any sales environment, the people who are selling you something don't talk to you about the maintenance. You will never find a BMW salesman as part of the sale process to sell you a BMW, tell you what the maintenance service calls are going to be for the next 3 years. They never talk about it, because if he told you it's going to cost you $2,000 a year for service calls, because guess what, when you want air in the tires, you have to buy Bavarian air. Yeah. But you get the, but you don't
understand.
But my point is, as an industry, we've ignored management. In fact, it's very interesting. I'm moderating the panel tomorrow, the management panel, which is actually the very last panel of the show before the lock note, when almost everybody's left, is the point we bring up the issue of how do you manage this thing you're building and keep it from getting you fired? Which is, in many ways, for most people, the single most important thing they should be thinking about. So anyway, that's why I get excited about it.
All right, we're running tight on time, 30 seconds or less. Have you had an aha moment at the show?
I think one aha moment was Google. I think that was a bit of an aha. I think the Amazon announcement of their contact center products is an aha moment, not because of that, but because of Amazon building a modular structure to build next generation computing platforms, and that's a whole discussion we could spend 15 minutes on. I will tell you the one thing that I saw that's very close to everybody here is a company called, I think it's Nuvia. Actually, the folks who founded Smart Technology, they've built a microphone system. It basically looks like a big sound bar, on steroids, about this long, about this wide, about this deep. What they've done is they've taken beam shaping. So beam shaping is I've got 4 mics. I measure the time delay between the sound, and I can actually figure out that sound's coming at this angle, so I can tune out all the other sounds and concentrate what I hear. So a beam shaping mic kind of tracks. What they've done is they're using, I think, 10 or 12 mics, and they're actually able to do distance beam shaping. So instead of having a channel line, they actually have points on that line. So they actually generate about 9,000 virtual microphone locations in a room. And they actually tune that constantly to who's talking. And the demo that I saw was absolutely impressive. That a guy in another room, they're actually in Calgary, walking around, and he's walking around and talking, you hear him perfectly. The end of the demo, he walks into the far corner of the room, walks into the corner, faces in the corner, 6 inches off the wall and talks, and you can hear him like he was talking to a microphone on the desk. I thought that was pretty impressive.
That's
technology
pretty
for $3,000 to put on the wall of your room. So I think that was really one of those things where I was really impressed that somebody innovated and delivered cool technology.
We should be using that for the live stream.
Absolutely. I got to tell you, you got to go look. I was really impressed. And it takes a lot to impress me, you can kind of probably tell.
Well, I find you're shy. You know, your opinions are close to your vest. You got to work on that. You got to come out more.
I keep everything in.
I see. They stop
because you know, if you let it out, you actually have to respond to it.
I understand.
But I don't tweet
You don't tweet?
early in the morning. I find that's just not a good idea.
Well, you know, there's some leadership in our political powers we could learn from you. With that, we will call it done. Phil, you've been a blast to talk to you. Thank you so much. Phil Edholm, PKE Consulting. Check him out. He's on the last panel tomorrow, and some would argue the most important panel here. Thanks for your time today, Phil. We'll be back soon. Don't go anywhere. Bye-bye.